Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Pieces guest speaker series. We've been talking with lawyer and paralegal bencher candidates about the upcoming election. As always, the views and opinions are of the candidates alone. They don't reflect me, Justice and Pieces, Charles College, or any other education institution or organization I'm affiliated with. This afternoon, we have Howard joining us. Now, Howard, first of all, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I've been practicing for 44 years. I've been doing nothing but labor and employment law for those period of time. I've written a bunch of books, 6 of them. I'm editor-in-chief of the Dismissal Employment Law Digest. I have 2 columns a week in the Financial Post, and I'm in the media all the time explaining the law to Canadians and making it accessible.
Perfect. I think that's a very succinct way to summarize 44 years of practice. Now that brings us, I guess, to the upcoming election. I know the last time you were thinking about running, and this time you put your name forward. Why are you running for bencher in the bencher election?
Well, I've always been interested in politics my whole life, my whole career, in different forms, and I think I'm relatively good at it. It can make contribution and have opinions on issues that matter in this election. You know, the average employee, the 550 employees of the Law Society, the average salary is $130,000. Now, it's a little bit like taxpayers in Canada looking at civil servants saying, boy, they're doing the same thing as I am, and they're making a lot more than I'm making for my own money. Well, it's the same thing here. The average law firm, I don't pay my top paid employee, non-lawyer employee, $130,000, let alone the average. And it's the same issue. We're subsidizing high-paid employees that we wouldn't be paying that amount ourselves to, which impacts directly in our dues. That's not my main reason for running, but it's one of the issues that struck me as I delved into it. The real reason, the main reason I run it, is because the Law Society is becoming too intrusive, too politically correct, and too interventionist in matters that really are not their domain. And when you say the name Law Society to most lawyers, they hide under their desks. They're fearful. When I get a letter, I see Law Society, I get nervous. What have I done? What has someone done in my law firm? Instead of being a friend, I think of immediately, what am I going to have to consume 6 months of my time on that was totally irrelevant and absurd to begin with? And that's not the role of the Law Society. The role of the Law Society is to protect the public from, the main role in this context, protect the public from fraudsters, from lawyers sexually harassing their clients, from predators, protect them from dishonest lawyers who shouldn't be practicing law. And that's the regime that should prevail. But particularly when they started getting into the woke stuff and disciplining for political principles and other intrusive aspects, it has to be stopped.
So you've touched on, I guess, a couple of the pillars there of the full stop team: stop bloat, stop creep, stop woke, and essentially how the Law Society has lost its ways. So can you maybe expand a little bit more? I know you've given some examples there of why you yourself and the rest of the team there is coming together and saying this needs to stop.
Because it does need to stop. That's why we come together, and because the way politics works is if you have people who have the same point of view and are allied, at least in major issues, then you say vote for all of us, and that way you'll stop it. Howard Levitt's not going to stop it by himself on one vote. You want to have the majority of votes in order to effectively stop it. Last time, my predecessors on the slate who ran, they didn't get the majority, so they were unsuccessful in doing what they set out to do. They stopped the statement of principles because it was so egregious. But there's 15 other recommendations from the same task force in December 2016 that are going to accomplish exactly the same thing, that the more governance slate, as I call them, is going to continue with and is never disavowed as we have. So we need to run as a group in order that enough of us get elected. And they talk about the more governance slates talks about our working as a group. Well, they're working as a group as well. But here's the point. The incumbents on the more governance slate voted unanimously on Law Society matters about 3 to 4 times more than the Stop SOPs group, in other words, my predecessors did last time during the last 4 years. So we did not vote as a block. We voted as a block on those critical issues. But otherwise, we represent our constituents. We represented our point of view. We didn't work as a block. In fact, in the last year, the people who are running on the good governance or more governance slate, who are running again and were incumbents from the last term, if you take out the abstentions, they voted unanimously on 100% of votes in convocation, 100%. And I'm not talking about necessary statement of principle issues, on everything. That's what you don't want. You want people with different opinions. And I don't have the same opinions and everything as the other people on my slate. We're united on 2 or 3 items that are critical to the Law Society. And that's why we're working together, and that's why we're running, and that's what we hope to achieve. The bloat, as you talked about, the woke. But I characterize the bloat as not merely financial bloat. I gave one example a moment ago. I'm talking about mission creep, moving forward and intervening in every aspect of lawyers' lives, where wokeism is simply one approach they take. But that's a problem with bureaucracies. They get bigger and bigger and bigger and higher paid, and they intend to make missions for themselves. And it's not protecting the public, who should be protected. That is the core mission.
And you brought up there the idea of a group coming together, and one of the main things, from talking to people from the coalition is that, well, this is a problem. That's why we've come together to make our slate, and if we're elected, then it'll dissolve. I mean, is there anything inherently wrong with people organizing, associating, and saying, hey, these are the issues that we feel strongly about, and we want to run together? Or does that not kind of belong in a board of directors setting? What are your thoughts on that, Howard?
Well, this is a political situation, and last I've heard, in the federal government, provincial government, they all run as parties if they have any hope of being elected. But here it's even more poignant, arguably, because there are 2 or 3 critical issues that I've just elucidated upon, at least briefly. And if you're going to stop them, at least you're going to change the direction of the Law Society in those critical areas. 1 vote's not going to do it. 5 votes isn't going to do it. The majority has to do it. So you have to, at least on those few issues, unite as a coalition and vote. I don't know what the other group, who call themselves a good governance slate, but I call them more governance slate, what their coalition is really about, other than preventing us from stopping bloat and stopping woke and stopping mission creep. They're more established with a more big firm. I run a firm that was small. Now it's 15 lawyers, sort of small, medium. And most of our people are from that background, small and medium sized firm lawyers or sole pracs. They're mostly, the other side isn't that. They represent, at least in political principle, generally what the big firms are doing. And not all the big firms, many of the big firms.
And I guess in terms of the dangers, let's say you bring up more governance, right? What is the biggest problem if we continue going in that direction? How it's going to affect licensees, whether it's paralegals or lawyers, newly called or people 44 years and up. How does this impact us, and why again this needs to kind of stop and from going into that direction further?
Well, there's an inclusive index, for example, that was passed and is supposed to be revisited every 4 years. And it, quite apart from the fact that it's statistically unsound in the way that they're attempting to gather statistics and therefore unreliable and unpredictable, the fact of the matter is it purports to name and shame lawyers and law firms. And that's not good. The second thing is, imagine if the statement of principles had been adopted, and therefore the Law Society was not only enabled, but effectively would be required to discipline lawyers who don't, in their view, in their woke view, act upon the statement of principles. And for example, I'm a writer in the National Post twice a week. So let's assume I expressed a conservative perspective on a political issue, and it wasn't seen as appropriate, sufficiently woke. Conrad Black, for example, was thrown off a radio station because he said that he does not believe that Canada is inherently racist. I'm just giving that as an example of political opinion that was expressed that wasn't sufficiently woke, and he was kicked off the radio station. Radio stations do what they want. They own it. As they always say, freedom of the press belongs to those who own one. But the point is, in the same way, you express an opinion that isn't sufficiently woke, the statement of principles would actually require the law study disciplines. And although the statement of principles is repealed, and it may not be reenacted in its existing form, that's just one of 16 recommendations along the same line that was adopted by Convocation in December 2016. And I don't want myself or any other member to risk being disciplined for not having the right political opinion. I had my own experience once with the Law Society where I referred to a decision of a privacy commissioner in Newfoundland as boneheaded in a National Post column. Why did I say that? Because it was boneheaded. It was ridiculous. It was ludicrous. I got hauled in by the Law Society because I was impolite. Well, I said, well, I'm writing as a columnist. First of all, I'm not practicing law when I write columns. But you, Mr. Levitt, you're a lawyer. It doesn't matter the context in which you're writing. Yes, you're writing as a journalist in the National Post, and I've been a journalist for decades in this Toronto Star and then the National Post. So I actually am a bona fide journalist. And I've had my own radio show for 11 years at News Talk 1010. So I'm a bona fide journalist. So they didn't question that. They didn't question the capacity. But they said, as a lawyer, any aspect of your life is governed by our rules and by our regulations and by our sense of propriety. Well, that's without a statement of principles having been adopted. But that's the direction the Law Society was increasingly heading toward before our slate got elected last time. And again, elected in minorities weren't able to do very much, but they're at least being able to loud enough to identify to the profession what was going on inside those hallowed chambers of Osgoode Hall. So to create enough political opposition for the Law Society continuing down that path. But if the more governance slate gets in, it'll be what it was personified, magnified. And everybody is at risk if you don't have the right perspective, the right political opinion. And it shouldn't be about that. It should be, are you a fraud? Are you a danger to a client? Look at what happened to Jordan Peterson. And if I'm going off too long, just interrupt me. Look what happened to Jordan Peterson. He was expressing political opinions, conservative political opinions, different than that of the prevailing view of the board, the College of Psychologists. Nothing, no one is saying, a couple of lunatics may have said at the beginning, but as the facts came out, no one is saying that it had anything to do with his practice of psychology. In fact, he had not practiced clinical psychology in 5 years. Those are the facts. And I act for Jordan in a case against Wilfrid Laurier. So I'm quite familiar with what was going on in this case as well. And he's hauled in because of something like the statement of principles. The act didn't even have that. But the spirit of it, he was, in their view, holding the psychologists in disrepute. And it's one thing to hold a law into disrepute, to hold lawyers in disrepute. If let's assume we were caught raping somebody in our off hours or sexually harassing a client, I get that, and that's right. We should be disciplined or worse if we do something calumnious in our private lives. But expressing political opinions is not calumnious. Yet Peterson was hauled out, facing charges, and beyond that, he's already been ordered before there's even a hearing to, at his own expense, be re-educated, shades of Maoist China. Well, the Law Society can do that, and they were heading in that direction. With a statement of principles, they'd be obliged to do that. And with the other 15 recommendations, they'll be obliged, which I'm confident the good governance, as they call themselves, the more governance, as I call them, slate gets elected, they will be adopted and they will be required to behave in the way the College of Psychologists did. I want to stop that. Look, I'm 70, I practiced 44 years, I've still got lots of vim and vigor and energy in me. Going to practice for a lot more years yet, but I've been around enough to understand how things work and what's dangerous and what's ultimately corrosive to lawyers as a profession. And that's the way we were going and will go if they get elected, in my view.
Now, Howard, if they don't get elected, if the Full Stop team gets elected, or any combination perhaps of unaffiliated candidates as well, now what's the direction that you'd like to see the Law Society be going on? What should they be focusing more on? What are the issues that leaving all of this to the side, that you'd like to see the Law Society, and what really should their role be as a regulator in the public interest? You've pointed out issues of competence, in terms of outright fraud. But I mean, is there anything more that the Law Society needs to be redirecting their resources, and the financial ones are certainly as well, in focusing on?
Well, understand, I'm not an incumbent. I've not been involved in the last 4 years. I don't know the gravamen of the minuscule issues that might be dealt with, or even more significant issues that are dealt with day to day. I'm simply not familiar with them, having been involved. But my view, to answer your question directly, as I've already espoused, there's two issues that are important. And let me start the first one, preface it this way. The average lawyer in Ontario makes the same as the average teacher in Ontario, about $92,000. Now that, depending on who the listener is, may seem like a lot or a little, but let me put some perspective on that. My first-year lawyers make over 100, sometimes well over 100, depending on how they start performing during their first year. And some make seven figures in my firm because they're productive and they deserve it. In the big firms, there's many people in each of the big firms that makes over $1 million a year, sometimes several $1 million. And when you take that, and there's lots of big firms or medium-sized firms, and some very successful sole or small practitioners like myself. So if you take a lot of lawyers in Ontario making over $1 million, and the average income is $92,000, it takes lots of people making nothing to make up for one lawyer making $1 million. The point is, there's lots of lawyers in Ontario making nothing, or actually losing money in the course of a year, compared to teachers. Now I'll offend the teachers who are modestly educated in comparison, work 9 months a year. If they don't want to work harder, they have to work a 3 or 4 hour day, have no threat of losing money. They have job security through their union. There just isn't any comparison. And the financial, nor have they had the financial cost that we've had to start practicing if we haven't joined a firm. So it's the same amount. Why am I talking about that? Because if lots of lawyers are losing money, or making $10,000 a year, $50,000 a year, $40,000 a year, $60,000 a year, anyway, even under the $92,000, which is the average in the province, and that means the vast majority are making less than that amount, then $2,000 a year is a lot to pay in law society fees. And if we get it down to $1,400 a year, $1,300 a year, that's a meaningful difference for them. Even for the big firms, you multiply it by the number of lawyers. And when I see the average salary of a law society employee of 550 employees, and why you need 550 employees for what the mission should be is beyond me, something that should be looked at and scrutinized, then that's a real contribution to get those fees down. And I'm not there, haven't been there yet, so I don't know what areas we have to get it down, other than perhaps having more market-based salary or more salaries concomitant with what we're paying our own employees as law firms. But it's something that, running a law firm myself with 15 lawyers, I know what to look for. I know what to look at. So that's a contribution I can make. What should the law society be focusing on? Well, they don't need 550 employees to focus on what I think they should be focusing on. They should be focusing on their statutory mandate, which is protecting the public, which is partly ensuring that lawyers are educated, keep up in their craft, and don't pose any threats to anyone. In fact, are facilitative of client needs, facilitating education, facilitating good conduct, and preventing bad conduct. but not pirouetting into ideological paroxysms of their own, which is what has been happening, what will happen, in my view, if a more governance slate gets in.
Now, Howard, you brought up sort of these financial barriers, and sort of by analogy that there's some lawyers making, well over $1 million. And then there are obviously to balance that out, there's some that are making, maybe 10, 20, 30,000.
Far more.
But we're all paying the same fee across the board, right? I mean, is that something that, looking at it, does it make sense for those who have that barrier into the profession that they should be paying the same as someone at a firm that's bringing in, millions of dollars? Or is there something that you would want to look at, or does that kind of go into, a different direction of separating it according to, your annual billings or anything like that?
Well, I haven't looked into it, and you raise it, and I find that interesting. And impressionistically, I'd favor that. If someone is making no money, the law study shouldn't make them pay money. If they're trying to get started in their practice, or they've already been there for several years, are working hard and not able to make it, the law study should give them a break. And people like myself and people in my firm who are making more money should subsidize that. I agree with that entirely.
Yeah, because I think even if you're not practicing, you still have to pay like 25% fees as well. So I'm not really sure what the value you're getting for continuing to hang up your plaque on the wall or something if you're transition out of practice there. The other thing there, again, related to those coming into the profession that's been talked about a lot is articling, and certainly maybe you can look back over the years and different iterations of that transition from law school into becoming a lawyer. And certainly, as you said, your first year associates are being paid quite well. Is that still something that, again, is important for the profession? Again, you're talking about competencies that you sort of make it work there in those 10 months, learn the tricks of the trade. Or, do we need to revisit looking at, more other alternatives, especially with sort of the inconsistencies you're seeing in articling placements, or the ones that may not be able to get anything at all?
I'm a great fan of the articling program for the reason you just espoused, that it means that you're going to be very well educated, or you should be well educated by the time you finish. Certainly, people we have them docket their time, and they work long hours, my articling students, and we make no bones about that coming in. But what about someone who cannot get an articling job? We can't, after 3 years of law school, prohibit them from practicing. But we have to find some meaningful alternative that attempts to replicate that situation. And I don't know what that is because I haven't studied it, but I accept the fact that you can't prohibit them from practicing because they have an article. But on the other hand, we've got to find some measure that gives them the equivalency of articling, substantively, not just theoretically.
The other thing, Howard, that's come up a bit is the law libraries and the law associations, and again, talking about funding and cost. And I don't know, again, maybe how much you've turned your mind to it yet, but perhaps maybe you could share in terms of the importance, or looking at maybe alternative ways in terms of continuing to have access, especially for small and solo practitioners, to the different law associations and the law libraries, whether in Toronto or around the province.
Well, there have to be law libraries for practitioners to use, because for the reason I gave earlier, a lot of lawyers, and particularly lawyers in smaller towns where there isn't the big city and finance marketplace that Toronto has, their clients aren't as affluent, can't afford to pay the same rates, and they don't make as much money. So there's real financial issues, particularly in smaller communities, and therefore they can't afford, to get back to your question, they can't afford to buy law books. They can't afford to create their own law libraries. They have to be able to go to a local library. So that's important. In Toronto, I think it's a little less important, because it's good to have some books at Osgoode Hall when you're on a case, the Court of Appeal. But frankly, if you want free access to a law library, go to U of T or Osgoode.
Now, Howard, getting back maybe to the younger generation or the next generation there, and certainly I have paralegal students, there may be law students or newly licensed lawyers listening to this, and looking for, again, some advice, some words of wisdom. And certainly you have a wealth of experience here in your 44 plus years of practice. Any
Not,
advice
not plus, not plus yet.
any advice, anything you want to share with them?
Boy, if I were doing it all over again, well, starting from the beginning, you've got to get out there and do it. That's the best advice. Get kicked down 100 times, whatever, and thank the person who kicked you for the lesson. But go out there and practice, take cases, go to trial, do the best you can, prepare well, and don't worry if you might lose. Don't be paralyzed by fear, because that is how you learn. I never had a mentor, never. I did it all myself. I created my starting with small firms, started my own firm at one point relatively early on. So there was nobody teaching me anything. Mentors are great, unless you have a personality that you can't be very tightly controlled, in which case mentors aren't great. It all depends on your personality as an individual. But the point is, if you don't have a mentor, it doesn't matter. Get yourself involved in the crucible of action and learn from that. And you'll get better and better and better. When I was in my early days, I was doing 4 discoveries a week of wrongful dismissal cases, at least, sometimes 5. And I learned against senior lawyers, and I made my mistakes. I learned from them. So be open to learning and try as hard as you can to get cases, whatever case you can get starting out, because it won't be easy starting out. You won't have any market appeal. It'll be your friend, your grandmother, whoever. But whatever case you can get, and learn from them. And don't be afraid because you're inexperienced, because you'll gain experience in time, and you won't gain experience without having experience. In other words, the experience itself will give you the experience.
Perfect. So Howard, thanks so much again for taking the time this afternoon here and speaking with me. Last question for any of the lawyers that are listening and have up to 40 votes in the upcoming election, which is 2 weeks away at the start of voting on the 19th of April. Why should they cast a vote for you?
Because I will be an articulate, strong spokesperson for what I've espoused over the last hour. If you want to stop mission creep, if you want to stop bloat, if you want to reduce fees, if you want to make sure the law society doesn't become too politicized in terms of wokeism, and if you want to make sure fundamentally that the law society sticks to its core mission of disciplining bad people and leaving others alone, vote for me and vote for the full stop slate. Because you need more than me to make it happen.
Thanks once again, Howard, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. Take care.